descriptive, or we can say representational role as well. Remember, one of the great bads for him is global descriptivism, which is a reductive monistic descriptivism that thinks a descriptive role is the only expressive role that vocabulary can play, and he's just right. There's others, but when he distinguishes describing from labeling by saying to describe, you have to be labeling with a concept. And for it to be a concept, it has to occupy a space in a position in a space of implications. That's a necessary condition of playing a descriptive role. Is it a sufficient condition? What I think it's a sufficient condition of is being assertable. Being expressible by a declarative sentence. Being, if you like, propositionally contentful. If you think of propositional contents as ones that essentially can both serve as premises and conclusions of inferences or implications. What I sometimes call the iron triangle of discursiveness has declarative sentences as a syntactic kind, asserting as a speech act kind, pragmatic kind, and propositional contents, sayables in the sense of assertables, as a semantic kind. All of them things that have to be made sense of together. Declarative sentences are what have, in the first instance, an assertable use, and asserting a declarative sentence is endorsing a proposition. Asserting and inferring in the pragmatics go together, and that's why propositional contents are the ones that can play the role both of premises and conclusions of inferences, or as we could say, can both stand in need of and serve as reasons. But things that are paradigmatically not descriptive vocabulary, like normative vocabulary, can be expressed by declarative sentences. I can say you ought not to have done that, or you were entitled to do that. And those are assertions. They stand in a space of implications with other things. If murder is wrong, then you ought not to murder people is a fine implication. I mentioned some time ago the difference between first wave and second wave meta-ethical expressivism. The first wave, sort of in its crudest form, is the boo-hurrah expressivism of Ayer and C.L. Stevenson. And I described the gem-like Geach essay Descriptivism, saying, yeah, well, that's fine for the freestanding use of these things, but what about the embedded use? These things can be used as antecedents of conditionals. We've stripped the force off of them. They're propositionally contentful. There is a perfectly intelligible notion of descriptive content that is a declarativist notion. It says you're in the fact-stating line of work, you are describing things, you are representing things as being a certain way if you're using declarative sentences, which is to say if you're making assertions, which is, in this sense, to be endorsing propositions. And anything that has a declarative use will be embeddable as the antecedent of a conditional, and will be attributable using a propositional attitude ascription. I can say not only you ought not to torture helpless wanderers, but John believes that you ought not to torture helpless wanderers. And if you ought not to torture helpless wanderers, then you ought not, in this case, to do the following. Declarativism is a perfectly intelligible notion of description, representation, fact stating. It's incredibly weak. Almost anything is fact stating, representational, descriptional in this sense. People like Rorty say, well, I'm a realist about all kinds of things because he's a declarativist about them, and denies that anything umphier than that is a sensible notion of representation, description, fact stating, and so on. But for instance, when people downstream from Dummett were realists or anti-realists about semantic claims, about the claim that red means red, for instance, is that a fact-stating use of language? Well, declarativism says sure it is. That's not the sense they were fighting over when they asked whether that was a fact. In scientific, in various versions of scientific realism, declarativism is way too permissive to be the sense we care about. So I claim, if we're going to think about whether modal vocabulary has a descriptive dimension, whether the fact that it plays the pragmatic, expressive, metalinguistic role that it does, which is the primary thing you're doing when you use modal vocabulary, which is different from what you're doing when you make an ordinary empirical descriptive claim. Because again, there's nothing that stands to the ordinary claim, no other vocabulary that stands to it as the OED vocabulary stands to the modal vocabulary. If we're to make sense of a consequent descriptive dimension, so that you really are saying that things are in a certain way, when what you're doing is endorsing a pattern of inference, a subjunctively robust pattern of inference, it's got to be broader than, but related to, the sense in which, when you use ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, you're describing, representing, stating facts. It's got to be broader because it's got to include this metalinguistic use. But it's got to be narrower than the declarativist use. That's just too promiscuous. It admits prescriptive vocabulary, sort of paradigmatically non-descriptive vocabulary as well. We need a Goldilocks intermediary notion. And here's my candidate for it. For an umphier notion of description that applies to the paradigmatic case of ordinary empirical description, fact-stating representation, but which we can see as applying to some other cases too. And this has its description in Sellars' sense, in that you have to be, by applying a concept descriptively, you have to be taking up a position in a space of implications. But you basically get that for the declarativist one. So how are we restricting that? By two more conditions, what I call epistemic tracking and what I call semantic governance. You have to be epistemically tracking the facts that you're stating, and you have to be semantically governed by the facts that you're stating. Epistemic tracking is an alethic modal matter. I'm going to put to the side whether this makes the account I'm giving circular. Let's worry about that on down the line. Semantic governance is a deontic normative matter. To be epistemically tracking something, say the melting point of copper, counterfactuals and subjunctives of the form, if the melting point of copper were different, I'd be talking differently. I'd be endorsing different claims. Has to be true. That is, I have to, as a matter of fact, be responding differentially to the way it is with the thing that I'm talking about, so as to underwrite subjunctive conditionals of the form. If the properties of copper were different, I'd be making different claims about it. Now, obviously, those are rough. There's lots of things I might not know about copper, or things that I'd be getting wrong. It's a more or less notion, but it's a tracking notion. It is, parenthetically, what people like Tretzky and Fodor wanted to do all the work in explaining the notion of representation. It's a notion of epistemic tracking. Fodor's one-way counterfactual dependence. And Tretzky and Fodor, each one has some advantages over the other one. They're sort of incomparable in strength, but they say plausible things about how to make sense of this. Semantic governance. So our claims have to be semantically tracking what we are going to claim we're describing, representing, talking about, the facts that we're stating. In the other direction, those facts have to semantically govern our utterances in the sense of providing standards for assessments of the correctness or incorrectness of the claims that we're making. Normative attitudes come in two flavors, corresponding to two different social perspectival contexts, the context of deliberation and the context of assessment. Semantic governance, in this sense, we can understand entirely from the point of view of the context of assessment. That is, if somebody wants to know whether my claim about copper is right, what sets the normative standard that they use to assess whether my claim is correct or not? And has to be, they would consult the thing that I'm talking about. The underlying idea behind this is Kant's normative understanding of intentionality, which I've talked about as, in my view, his axial idea that what distinguishes our judgments from the responses of merely natural creatures is that they're things we're in a distinctive sense responsible for. They express commitments of ours. They're exercises of our authority to commit ourselves. But he has a more specific reading, going a little bit even farther out on an interpretive limb here, of the notion of representation that's at the center of his semantic thought, that that relation too is a normative relation, the relation between representings and representeds, that that representational relation is a relation in which the representeds exercise authority over the representings, which are correlatively responsible to the representeds, responsible to what counts as represented by them, just in virtue of exercising this kind of normative authority, what I'm calling semantic governance over them, namely that the representings are the source of the standard of normative assessment of correctness of what count as representings of them, just by being subject to that distinctive kind of normative assessment. Now, obviously, there's a lot of filling in that needs to be done in that picture, but I'm claiming that's the Kantian insight into the nature of representation. That's what he understood about it, that the pre-Kantian tradition that used the notion of representation Descartes had invented did not. So what Spinoza didn't understand that Kant did, when Spinoza says the order and connection of things is the same as the order and connection of ideas, is that the order and connection of ideas is a normative order, and the order and connection of things is a causal order. He didn't understand that difference. But Kant thinks not only that, but that the relation between them is itself a normative relation. And this notion of semantic governance is when somebody's assessing the correctness of my copper claims or my lion claims, do they appeal as the ultimate standard, a normative standard governing those assessments, determining those assessments, the very fact that I'm also epistemically tracking. So, there's a lot that could and should be said about both these dimensions. They're in different directions as I think about it, as I think of them. That is, my claims epistemically track the facts, and the facts normatively govern the claims. The normative governance is a normative matter, providing a standard for assessment of correctness. The epistemic tracking is a matter of reliable dispositions, connecting us. So the claims I want to make about those two dimensions are, they're both in play in ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. And they're added to the mere declarativism. So we get a narrower notion than mere declarativism. For instance, I would want to say that in mathematical discourse, there's semantic governance by the mathematical facts and objects one's talking about, but there is no epistemic tracking of them, because there's no reliably covariant causal chains connecting us with the things. There are objects, there are facts that we're talking about, I think, but it's not exactly the same sense as there is in the empirical case, because there's only half a notion there. It's closer to the declarativist thing than there is in this case. I've actually written about that specifically in an essay called The Significance of Complex Numbers for Frege's Philosophy of Mathematics. If you want to think more about how that could work. But I'm saying here's a stable, potentially interesting thing to mean by description, sense of description, that's narrower than the declarativist way, and yet which can include other things, have different features than the paradigm case of empirical descriptions. So that's the sense in which I want to say that modal vocabulary is also descriptive. Fact stating has a representational dimension. So that there is something that you're saying when what you're doing is, what you're doing by asserting a modal claim is endorsing a pattern of subjunctively robust inference. When you're doing that, what you're saying is that things are thus and so. In a sense of saying that, you're describing them as, representing them as, being a certain way, stating facts, in this double-barreled sense of talking about something that you're epistemically tracking and that semantically governs your saying. And those are the real connections, remember Sellars' expression, between objective empirical properties like copper and melting at 1084 degrees C, which underwrite the implicational relations between them that articulate our empirical concepts of copper and melting at that temperature. And it's those that we have to find out about in order to find out what the facts about copper are, the ordinary empirical descriptive facts. In order to discover those facts, we also have to settle the subjunctively robust relations among them. Those are two sides of one coin. Because what copper is a matter of these real subjunctively robust relations among properties. I said that Dretske and Fodor and other people have tried to make the epistemic governance do all the work. I think there's characteristic places where that enterprise falls down, so that we can see that if there is a notion of description that only has that, it's not good enough to explain the paradigmatic use of descriptive vocabulary. Two of the classic problems with that sort of view are, first of all, what you can establish by epistemic tracking alone is that there's a causal chain of reliably covariating events that's starting with the clapper of the bell hitting the bell and going through the vibrations of the bell and through then the sound waves and then the vibration of my tympanic membrane and then a cascade of neurophysiological things. But how do you pick which of the things in that chain it is that you're epistemically tracking? They're all covarying. You're more reliable the nearer you get to you, because there's sort of more things that can go wrong the farther out on that chain you get. So if you're in an epistemological search for certainty, you're going to end up saying things like, well, all you really perceive is the movement of your eardrum, or maybe the stimulation of your auditory nerve, or maybe the sensa that you get, the sense impressions that you get. How is it that you say, no, I'm hearing the bell, or even the sound of the bell, rather than feeling the vibration of the membrane? Well, Dretske says in something that I think is in the right direction. He picks up a Davidsonian idea of triangulation and says, well, look at the intersection of two of these things. That's how you would pick out something distal, a distal stimulus rather than a proximal one that's farther out there. I think that's in the right direction, but not quite right. I think you need the semantic governance and you need the space of implications. So the way this comes up in Quine, turns out I'm a really good, reliable reporter of the presence of rabbits in the jungle when no one else can see the rabbits. And you do an investigation of this and you realize that there's a causal chain that starts with the rabbits and ends up with me saying there's a rabbit. But it goes through these rabbit flies that are constant companions of the rabbits and never accompany anything else. And I'm actually responding to the rabbit flies. It's when I can sort of see the rabbit flies that I say there's a rabbit. Now, what is it that makes it rabbits that I'm reporting and not rabbit flies? What makes it that distal stimulus? Well, what's the inferential role played by the term that I apply? If you ask me for this term that I'm applying, so quine, I'm saying gavagai, and you ask me, well, can those gavagai fly? And I say, no, they run along the ground. Oh, well, are they bigger than the tip of my finger? Oh yeah, they're much bigger. They're the size of your head. Oh, well, you're looking at all the inferences that I would make from it. That's what makes it that I'm talking about the rabbit and not the rabbit flies. That's what mediates the triangulation. It's those proprieties of inference. That's a matter of semantic governance and of inference. That's what's missing from a pure epistemic tracking account. That's one problem. Second problem that Dretske himself realized and made famous is what he called disjunctivitis. So I get trained to respond reliably, differentially to porcupines by saying there's a porcupine. Now, I've never seen an Australian echidna, but they look a lot like porcupines, even though they're not mammals. But if I saw an echidna, I would say there's a porcupine. So what is it that makes my term mean porcupine and not porcupine or echidna? Mean this disjunctive thing that includes all the mistakes I would make because I'm disposed to call them this. Or suppose that it happens that all the porcupines I've seen are adults, and I wouldn't call a baby porcupine. They don't look that much like adults. I wouldn't call it a porcupine. I'm only disposed to respond differentially to the adult porcupines. Well, what makes my term mean the wider porcupine and not the narrower adult porcupine? Or even adult porcupine seen in good light, because I'm not that good with the dark. Well, what semantically governs assessments of the correctness of my utterance? I'm playing a counter in a public game, and the people who are teaching me are going to say, no, that's an echidna, not a porcupine. You're mistaken in not calling that baby porcupine a porcupine. Those are porcupines too. The standard they're going to consult to assess whether my claim is right or not is the porcupine standard, not the porcupine or echidna standard or the adult porcupine standard. That's what makes it that I'm representing them as porcupines. That's determining the content of my utterance. Again, if all you have is epistemic tracking, how do you respond to the disjunctivist challenge and pick out a unique thing with respect to which errors are possible on your part? Well, that's what the semantic governance does for you. So, I claim there's a well-defined intermediate notion of descriptive content or representational content or fact-stating role that something can play, which isn't as broad as the declarativist one, but which extends more broadly, applies to cases that are different, and importantly different from simple empirical use of empirical descriptive vocabulary that does not have any metalinguistic significance. And that's the criteria of adequacy. If it turns out that on this conception, you can say modal vocabulary plays a descriptive role in this double-barreled sense of epistemically tracking and being semantically governed by features of the world, in virtue of playing the expressive role that Sellars identifies for it. Then we can have our cake and eat it too. We can understand the insight that Sellars had into the metalinguistic characterization of what we're doing when we make first-hand use of the modal vocabulary. But we can also say, just because it plays that metalinguistic role, it also stands in relations of epistemic tracking and semantic governance to features of the world, which it accordingly counts as describing or representing, to facts that it counts as stating. And my attempt to do that is epitomized in this picture. So vocabularies are in the ovals, and facts are in the rectangle, and properties, or facts if you like, are the smallest squares. Concepts or claims are the smallest circles. The solid lines are modal relations, subjunctively robust relations, and the dotted lines are normative relations. So, if we just look at the left half of the picture here, we have ordinary empirical descriptive states of affairs in the lower box. And those are the determinate states of affairs that they are, the little boxes, because of the relations of consequence and incompatibility that they stand into each other. Copper is copper because being copper has different consequences than being silver. It's related to temperatures differently. So copper melts at a lower temperature than silver does. If you heated copper to this temperature, it would melt, but if you heated silver to that temperature, it wouldn't. That's what those solid lines are representing, is those relations between the states of affairs in which they are the determinate properties that they are. If you think about a David Armstrong type account of the individuation of properties, it's in terms of the law-like relations that they stand in to one another. That's what this is. I mean, he's a good modal realist. That's what this is a picture of. And when all things go well, there's an isomorphic structure of concepts and claims up here in the vocabulary. That is, when all goes well, when the order and connection of things is isomorphic to the order and connection of ideas, we treat as a good inference from its being copper to its melting at 1084 degrees C, and its melting at 1084 degrees C as incompatible with its being silver. That is our normative rules for manipulating the concepts and drawing one claim as a consequence of another or treating it as decisive evidence against it, will, insofar as we're getting things right, be isomorphic. Now, what brings about that isomorphism? Well, it's the relations of epistemic tracking and semantic governance between the empirical states of affairs and our use of this ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. I mean, there's stories that need to be filled in about absolutely every piece of what I've said here, but I'm just trying to get the large-scale structure of this right. Now, Sellars's pragmatic metalinguistic expressivism about the modal vocabulary. Now we're going to look at the relations between the left side and the right side of the picture. We've got modal vocabulary over on the right. And he says, Sellars' thesis about modality, that you already know how to do everything you need to know how to do to deploy modal vocabulary if you can use ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. Right? You've got to already make a distinction between materially good and materially bad inferences, and those have got to be subjunctively robust, so you've got to make, however rough and ready, a distinction between the circumstances, the ways things could be different without infirming this inference, and the ways things, and the differences that would infirm the inference. So, your capacity to use the ordinary vocabulary can be elaborated into a capacity to use the modal vocabulary. All we need to do is recruit the abilities you already have and suitably deploy them and hook them up to this new vocabulary. It's as though you could make the inferences, you could tell which ones were good and bad, even though you sometimes got it wrong. And now we said, oh, when the inference from P to Q is a good one, then you can say, if P then Q. And that's the circumstances of appropriate application. And if you say, if you're committed to if P then Q, then you're committed to treating the inference from P to Q as a good one. So if you can sort the inferences into materially good and bad ones, then we can teach you how to use the conditional. Because you already know everything you need to know how to do. To use it, you just don't have a word for it. So you don't have a claim you can make. That's what this L relation is. It says you can elaborate the capacities to use ordinary descriptive vocabulary into the capacity to use the modal vocabulary. There's a way of putting together those abilities that'll add up to the ability to use modal vocabulary. And then what do you have when you're using the modal vocabulary? The modal vocabulary then lets you make explicit, lets you say what before was only implicit in what you could do. So what before you could do was practically treat some inferences as good or bad. But now you can say, if P then Q. And that lets you say explicitly what was implicit in what you could do before. That's what the X is. X for explicit, the L for elaborate. So a way of putting Sellars' pragmatic metalinguistic expressivist analysis of modal vocabulary is that modal vocabulary is LX with respect to ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. Its use can be elaborated from and is explicative of the use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. Now, I actually wrote a whole book on this notion of LXness. It was my Locke lectures called Between Saying and Doing. So if you want to know more about this, boy, do I have a lot more to tell you about it. But maybe you don't need to wade through all of that. to sort of get the point here. The claim I want to make then is that if you've got the relations between the relations on the left side of epistemic tracking and semantic governance between ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary and the facts, and you've got the metalinguistic relations between the left-hand side and the right-hand side at the top, the LXness of the modal vocabulary, the composition of those is going to be relations of epistemic tracking and semantic governance, really of the connections rather than the dots. I couldn't get the diagram to quite do what I wanted to do there. But the claim I want to make is that the composition of those sets of relations are recognizable as relations of epistemic tracking of and semantic government by objective features of the world. This is different from just describing how the world is, because it's pragmatically mediated by the use of this other vocabulary. The only way these relations get established is by going through the use of ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. It's, I say, pragmatically mediated. The relation between the modal vocabulary and what it's about has in between it essentially goes through the use of this other vocabulary. By contrast, the relations of epistemic tracking and semantic government by ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary is not pragmatically mediated. It's not going through the use of any other vocabulary. So that's why the empiricists were right and Sellars is right to see modal vocabulary as having a different status than ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary does. It's metalinguistic. But Sellars was wrong to think that therefore it didn't have a descriptive role. Or as we could say, that the only sense in which it did was a declarativist sense. Now, I have to confess that my story about how the composition of the vertical relations on the left and the horizontal relations at the top adds up to, institutes the horizontal relations at the bottom, is less fully worked out than the rest of the story that I've told you. So you can think of it as aspirational. But what I am hoping will be enlightening is we sort of leave Sellars at the end of CDCM in a pickle. He's got a real insight into the distinctively metalinguistic character of modal statements. And this potentially solves a huge outstanding problem. The epistemological problem of how we could actually know anything about modal vocabulary, and the consequent sort of semantic problem about how, if we can't solve the epistemological problem, what's said by these modal expressions is so much as intelligible. That's where Hume and Carnap and Quine were. And the situation is, if anything, much more urgent for us now than it was for Sellars in 57, because we have the treasures of wave after wave of the modal revolution that raise the stakes for showing that we're entitled to use these expressions. We really can't do without them now, not just because we're naturalists, broadly naturalists, in thinking about science, but we can't do philosophy without them anymore. And that didn't used to be true. That's what's changed in here. So the stakes are much higher. So the prospects of using his insight here to entitle ourselves philosophically to use these and to explicate the kind of content they have, they're even higher than they were when he wrote this. And yet, they aren't metalinguistic in the strict Tarski-Carnap sense. The translation test and the counterfactual test show that what you're saying when you say, if you heat this sample of pure copper to 1084 degrees C, it will necessarily melt, is not anything about the use of expressions or about the goodness of inferences. What you're saying isn't about that. If you're saying anything, you're saying something about the world by them. And that's what I've described as saying his insight is about what you're doing when you say something with modal vocabulary, so something that would be put in a pragmatic metavocabulary. And it's really up in the air what conclusions we could draw about what you're saying when you're saying something that does that, as we would describe it in a semantic metavocabulary. And that's what he couldn't see how to get back and forth between. But I'm suggesting if we think of this intermediate notion of descriptive content articulated by the joint requirement of epistemic tracking of what you're representing or describing and semantic government by what you're representing or describing, we can conjoin that account with Sellars' own account of the relation, of the pragmatic relation of modal vocabulary to ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, and end up with an account of what you're saying when you say, when you make firsthand use of these modal expressions. And here's at least the sketch of the way that story might go.
I just want to be clear about the diagram. Yeah, cool. This isn't anywhere, presumably. Yeah, okay, cool. I'm just wondering, so the
when you say it isn't anywhere, you mean
well,
I haven't published this.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's
right.
Because I hadn't seen it. So the claim is that the dotted arrow going from the OED to the modal vocabulary is the composition arrow of the semantic governance and the elaborated from arrow, and then the
you need all four of the two vertical arrows and the top horizontal arrows to get the two bottom arrows. So this, it's not that just semantic governance will go through and give you semantic governance.
Oh, so it's not just that this is the composition of this and this, and
right.
This is the composition of this and this, but okay, I see. So it's not a sort of normal composition relation, or
well, I mean,
I'm not sure.
You could put this in your category theoretic terms, but you're going to have to use as your arrows the arrow that it is gotten by bundling together the ET and SG arrows and the X and the L arrows.
Okay.
So, I mean, category theory is completely non-committal about these things. Yeah. They're going to be decomposed into a normative relation going one direction and an epistemic relation going the other direction for the vertical ones and the bottom right ones, and normative relations going in both directions for the top ones. Mm-hmm. And the bit where I'm not pretending to have the worked out in all of its details and meeting the criteria of adequacy account in my hip pocket is explaining just how that composition
Okay. Mhm.
works. That's
Mhm.
aspirational. I mean, I have
Mhm.
things to say about it, but there's, bits that don't work
Right, that's helpful,
and
though.
bits that I don't know how to fill in at the moment. So this is and a piece of this is to say that a notion of representation for mathematical objects and abstracta, the things we're going to start talking about for next week, I think can come out of this sort of looking just like this, except there's no ET arrow on the far left. But corresponding things where you have abstract object talk instead of modal talk over here as essentially metalinguistic. I think a story like that can be told. Sellars is going to, looking ahead, we're spending the next 2 weeks on his nominalism, which is parenthetically the best worked out part of Sellars' philosophical system. It's the part he really figured out what he wanted to say about and got it all working in these 3 essays that he wrote in the 2 years immediately after this. When we look at that, we'll see he takes the same lesson from Carnap. Carnap saying that when I say triangularity is a property, that's really a disguised metalinguistic statement. It's a quasi-syntactic statement. Later on he'll say it's the material mode version of a formal mode statement that quote, ... is triangular, quote, is a one-place predicate. That's the metalinguistic equivalent, Carnap says, of triangularity is a property. Now Sellars sees that that won't do as it stands for reasons very much analogous to what's wrong with treating modal vocabulary as metalinguistic in the Tarski-Carnap sense. To say triangularity is a property isn't to say anything about the expression is triangular. For instance, if we translated it all into German, that expression would stay in English, and that's not right, and so the counterfactuals are different. So Sellars is going to try and clean that up, and he makes more progress on that in the case of the abstract objects. But I'm going to want to say in the end something about that case, something like what I say about this case, that though he's got a very good, essentially correct account of what you're doing when you use abstract object talk, including talk about facts and propositions, as well as properties, universals, and so on. He's wrong to think that that precludes a descriptive dimension too, though that descriptive dimension will not involve relations of epistemic tracking, because we're not in causal relations of the right kind with those things. But if a story like this can be told that appeals only to the semantic governance side, then we'll see how, all right, it's descriptive in a yet more attenuated metalinguistic sense. But this will be a response also to empiricist epistemological worries about our relation to abstract objects, things like numbers. So all of this is meant to illustrate that Sellars brings us to the core of some really important and difficult philosophical issues, and gives us the conceptual resources to reformulate them in a way that sort of points a way forward. In, on the one hand, the epistemology of modality, and aspirationally looking forward in the epistemology of abstract objects.
Good. Just a question about the relation between epistemic tracking and semantic governance. And specifically, I'm wondering about cases in which we might be tracking, epistemically tracking a class of objective facts, but taking our expressions to be semantically governed by a different class of epistemic facts. So I think it's possible that color might work like this. We take our color predicates to be semantically governed by perceptible properties of objects in the world. Now, bracketing whatever your view of color is, one possible scenario is that, in fact, those aren't the properties that we're epistemically tracking. What we're actually epistemically tracking is something like regularities in our sort of neurophysiological functional things. And I'm wondering what sort of, so we have, sort of these modal facts, if something's red, then it's colored, if something's red, then it's not green. We take these to be semantically governed by these perceptual properties of objects, but if something like Sellars' story about sense impressions is right, then what we're actually epistemically tracking with all of these facts are, things in our heads. And I'm wondering about,
well,
maybe not. Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
He would certainly dig in his heels at that last characterization, again, because the claims we're making, if you look at the inferential consequences of them and so on, they're properties of the things out there. But I think that you're right, that there's all sorts of ways in which the epistemic tracking and the semantic governance could get out of whack with one another, that aren't the simple sort of absence of one. And I confess I hadn't thought about cases where there was genuine semantic governance and there was genuine epistemic tracking, but we can imagine cases, but they only overlap with, they only have an overlap in common, or are actually disjoint, where we have a sufficiently false theory about what we're doing that, though we are talking, maybe phlogiston talk is a case where it's actually epistemically tracking the behavior of oxygen, but the semantic governance is by something quite different because of collateral commitments, and in that case something that doesn't really exist, something that, where there aren't really properties that correspond to that. So, one of Sellars' star students, Paul Churchland, published the dissertation he wrote for Sellars' version of it as a thin book, The Plasticity of Mind, which is about non-inferential reports that are applications of concepts in wildly defective theories. He has a detailed discussion of the phlogiston case. So, there isn't anything corresponding to the inferential roles of the things in the theory. If we ramified the theory and looked for the best realizers of it, none of them would be very good, and they'd be wildly different from one another, and yet those concepts can have observational uses, and so are tied up to RDRDs. I would think it would be the kind of issue that he's discussing there that we'd want to look into for the cases I hear you as putting on the table.
So I'm just wondering, like, just given the Sellarsian view of sense impressions, why it doesn't qualify as epistemic tracking with color vocabulary. So there's this, collection of sensory states that stand in these alethic modal relations. If they were different, or color vocabulary would be different. That's just an alethic modal.
Well, they're certainly they're the most proximal elements in one of those causal chains of reliably covariant events, the RDRD. The question is sort of how far down that line you got. And I would take it that because we make because of the inferences, and I would think the semantic governance, so the way we make assessments of the correctness, I would think that would mandate a distal referent.
Yeah, but then the claim would be that there is in fact no distal referent that we're epistemically tracking. So it's the only candidate distal reference. So insofar as objects don't instantiate these properties, then
I think you're not going to find aid and comfort for that. And Sellars' discussion of color, he's going to insist that it is more wildly counterfactual than you would have it, because it must be the case that things like reflectances and wavelengths and so on are reliably being responded to by the occurrence of a red star, triangular star sense impression that would support inferences about the ripeness of apples and the status of the traffic light. So I think your counterfactual from his point of view is something like, well, suppose phenomenalism were true. But be that as it may, that's not saying there couldn't be cases of the kind you're describing. But I
think more about the color case,
and it could be sense impressions that we're talking about.
I didn't want to say that because the semantic governance would be with respect to a different class of properties, but that's just, the thought was just that's the only thing that we could be said to be tracking, because those are the only things that stand in the right sort of relations. So reflectance properties just don't stand in the right sort of relations. So just like the argument for structure against identifying colors with reflectance properties.
Okay, so if you've got a seriously an error theory about color talk, it doesn't need to fall all the way down to a phenomenalism for you to ask what we would say about it. I mean, Sellars would still resist, but that's because he doesn't have that sort of error theory about color, but he's also not looking at all of the sorts of work that's been done in between. So, yeah, that would be an interesting case. Presumably our mathematical discourse is not defective in that way, but this would be a kind of defect, I want to say generically, of the sort that Churchland was looking into, and an interesting kind of case to think about when thinking about epistemic governance and epistemic tracking and semantic governance. Okay, well, let me recommend for next time that you do give at least a quick go-through of all three of those essays on nominalism so that you know what's going on in them. I'll be post-holing with some of them, and of course there'll be particular passages to focus on. But this is the best worked out part of his system, really sort of the mature Sellars at his best. So, Okay, see you next time.